Welcome to this New Books and the Humanities event. My name is Matthew Hart. I'm the chair of the Department of English and Comparative Literature, and we are here to celebrate Scream With Me, a new book by Eleanor Johnson. I'm just going to begin with a few thank yous. Thank you to Lindsay and to everyone at the Heyman Center for putting this event on, for hosting us and for supporting the series. We'd like to give thanks to Bruno Bostiels, Dean of the Division of Humanities of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, for their support of this series. And thank you most of all to Eleanor for bringing us together on this occasion and writing this book for us. I'm going to just do brief introductions of all of our panelists at the start of the event. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will speak. In fact, that's not quite right. I'll introduce Eleanor last, although Eleanor will speak first. But otherwise, I will do that. One of our panelists, Sarah Novicic, has had some trouble getting through Columbia's gate policy, so she will be joining us as soon as we can get her QR code and get her through the scanners and into the building, but we're going to begin in the meantime. So our first respondent today is Rob King. Rob is a professor of film and media studies at Columbia University School of the Arts. He's a film historian with interests in American genre cinema, popular culture, and social history. Much of his work has been on comedy. His award-winning The Fun Factory, the Keystone Film Company of the Emergence of Mass Culture from the University of California Press in 2009, examined the role Keystone's filmmakers played in developing new styles of slapstick comedy for moviegoers of the 1910s. Sarah Novicic is the Associate Director of Graduate Studies and Associate Professor of English at Rutgers, New Brunswick. She specializes in medieval literature. Her research interests include poetry and poetics, drama and performance cultures, gender studies, archival theory, visual culture, fiction, and travel literature. She has essays on these subjects in an array of journals, including Exemplaria, New Medieval Literatures, JEGP, Post-Medieval, and Philological Quarterly. Her first book, Shaping the Archive in Late Medieval England, from Cambridge, examines how episodes of sacred history, in particular the loss of Eden, the flood, and the harrowing of hell, illuminate the risks and pleasures of archival process. Julie Stone-Peters is the H. Gordon Garbadian. That's how I say your chair name, Julie. I've actually never pronounced it out loud before. Garbadian. All right, let's go with that then. The H. Gordon Garbadian Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, and mine and Eleanor's colleague. She's also an affiliated faculty member at Columbia Law School and a global professorial fellow at Queen Mary University School of Law in London. A scholar of law and humanities and media history, Julie studies performance, film, digital, and legal cultures across the longue durée. Her most recent books are Staging Witchcraft Before the Law, Skepticism, Performance as Proof, and Law as Magic in Early Modern Witch Trials, and Law as Performance, Theatricality, Spectatorship, and the Making of Law in Ancient, Medieval, and Early Modern Europe. And this leads me to Eleanor Johnson, our star turn for tonight. Eleanor is a professor of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia University. She specializes in late medieval literature and culture, and in addition to Scream With Me, is the author of 3 scholarly books, Practicing Literary Theory in the Middle Ages, Staging Contemplation, and the award-winning Waste and the Wasters, all from the University of Chicago Press. But Eleanor is also the author of 2 collections of poetry, The Dwell, Scrambler Books 2009, and Her Many Feathered Bones, a great title, from Achiote 2010. And the thing that her official biography doesn't quite get across is the variety of topics on which she speaks and writes with her characteristic brilliance and authority. So that first book, Practicing Literary Theory, the title of which sounds a bit like a textbook, introduced me to the world of prosometrics. It's an amazing book. Mixed forms halfway between poetry and prose, which Eleanor understands as a medium for ethical transformation. And in Staging Contemplation, she turns to the religious and the spiritual, arguing that in Middle English writing, the act of communing with the divine was far more common and far more portable across different kinds of human expression than we've often credited. And then there's Waste and Wasters, which is a hell of a title, and another new turn. Welcome. You missed your introduction, but it's okay. It was amazing.
New Jersey Thursdays, I'm so sorry.
All right. And then there's Waste and Wasters, which is a hell of a title and another new turn, asking how medieval people in a pre-scientific age gave voice to the experience of ecological collapse and catastrophe. I could go on, but you don't want me to, so let me state the obvious. It's a long ride from medieval literature to Rosemary's Baby, or is it? That's one of the things I've been dying to ask ever since Eleanor first told me she'd launched a Substack and had started posting essays on horror and feminism. But before I get to ask that question, it's time to hear about Scream With Me, starting with its author. So please join me in a round of applause for Professor Eleanor Johnson and tonight's panelists.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Is it all right? Great. Thank you very much to everyone who's here. Thanks to Lindsay and the Heyman Center for hosting us. Thanks to Matt for that lovely introduction. I could count on one hand the number of times I've heard anyone say anything about that first book in the last 10 years, and you just made my day. Thank you so much. And I also want to say a thank you to all my students who are in the audience. Your luminous visages are always what engenders my best thinking and my happiest days. So I really appreciate those of you who are here, and I look forward to talking with you more in lecture for the rest of the semester as we continue to take apart what's going on in horror in American cultural history. So I thought I'd start out by telling you a little bit about how Scream With Me got born as a book, because there's a lot of mysticism that circulates around the writing of books. How do you write a book? How do you alight upon a topic? Sometimes you see a problem, you tackle it, you chase it down. Sometimes it evolves in some other way. Scream With Me was born weird, breach, as it were. I was teaching a course about 5 years ago. It was the original history of horror course that I taught, and it was 700 years of horror from Dante to the 21st century. Medium ambitious, I suppose, but it was a very fun class. And when I gave the Rosemary's Baby lecture on that year, I read the film the way I always read the film, which is that, among other things, it's a parable about the dangers of denying women reproductive autonomy. Right? The storyline there, for those who haven't seen the film, is that Rosemary is raped by Satan, becomes pregnant, doesn't know that it's a satanic baby that she's pregnant with. Welcome, have a seat. And goes through this excruciating, very, very dangerous, nearly lethal pregnancy, only eventually to deliver the Antichrist into the world. Now, I'm interested in that because, of course, if you even take the most extreme possible position in the pro-life camp, you cannot root for Rosemary to keep that pregnancy, because if you do, you are literally rooting for the Antichrist to enter into the world. So the film is designed as actually a pretty sophisticated theological experiment with how far you can push that logic, right? How far you can push a pro-life position. On top of that, Rosemary has two extenuating circumstances in her life. One, she's a victim of rape, and two, the pregnancy endangers her life, that resonated with what the New York State legislature was trying to accomplish in 1967 and 1968, which was specifically New York State was trying to liberalize, not legalize, but liberalize its own abortion laws so that women who are the victims of rape and women whose lives were endangered by their pregnancy could terminate pregnancy without breaking the law. And in both 67 and 68, that effort failed in New York State, and by a huge margin. It wasn't even close. Mid-68, this film comes out. It shows up close and personal for over 2 hours the agony, the terror, the fear, the dehumanization that the Rosemary character goes through because she's impregnated against her will and forced to take that pregnancy to term. And in the end, she does indeed give birth to the Antichrist, so nobody wins. Rosemary has a bad life, and the city of New York is hosed because the Antichrist was just born there. So we're all supposed to feel afraid. That's the nature of what I often call the horror hangover. Horror as a genre functions by giving you a little bit of a headache afterwards where you don't feel totally like everything is resolved. The horror hangover in Rosemary's Baby is the baby, right? The Antichrist was born. It was born in New York, and it was born because she was not allowed reproductive autonomy. So I gave that lecture in 2022. The next day, the Supreme Court leaked its decision to reverse Roe v. Wade. And I thought, oh, this is an emergency. So I'm happy to talk at greater length about how I went from medieval to film, but the short answer is I suddenly found myself face to face with an emergency and some time off. So I decided I would try to turn that Rosemary's Baby lecture into an article. I thought, this could be an Atlantic article. Problem is, once you start digging through mainstream horror films of the 1970s, as Dylan, you see more and more feminist trauma bubbling up again and again and again. And I started to see patterns, and I started to kind of select films that I thought were seriously engaged with the various manifestations of the women's rights movement or the failures of the women's rights movement in the 1970s. So the battle for reproductive autonomy, the battle to criminalize domestic violence and also improve the protections against it, because those are two slightly different things, and the battle, which ultimately did fail, to pass the Equal Rights Amendment into law. Okay, so these are three sort of simultaneously evolving and roiling legal changes in popular American culture, and all three of them get caught up by and very carefully examined by mainstream American horror films. And I mean like classic American horror films. Rosemary's Baby I've talked about. The others that I look at in detail in the book are The Exorcist, The Stepford Wives, The Omen, Alien, and The Shining. And what I started to notice when I had all these works in front of me and like could see that they were resonating with each other and with these legal changes I was interested in, is that all of these films specifically understood the home, the domestic sphere, the notional place of greatest safety for women, was theorized in all of these films as the place of greatest danger. People who work in the domestic violence or interpersonal, intimate partner violence space now all know that statistically and demographically, that's a fact. There's no safer place for a woman to be than in her home, period. That was not in public discourse anywhere in the 1970s, unless you look at film, and then it's everywhere. Right. So I made this book that explored the ways in which the horror genre not only kind of picked up what was going on, the ferment that was going on around women's rights in their own period, like how Rosemary's Baby picked up this kind of stressed, worried, panicked fear of death and mortality that was circulating around reproductive freedom, but also picked up dynamics in the culture that weren't yet being articulated in a clear, organized, discursive way. For example, women are less safe in the home than they are anywhere else. That wasn't anywhere in public discourse. And these films said, that's what's happening. Women are unsafe in their homes. And thus was born this genre, which in the book I call domestic horror. So horror that's defined by being set in the home in a domestic space where a female protagonist is circumscribed by the walls of her home and in which there is a male malefactor, usually but not always her husband, who is terrorizing her, dehumanizing her, and eventually going to either physically batter her or reproductively assault her in some way, or oftener than not, both of those things. So I included all these films that all do that in one way or another. And I started examining them and thinking about them. And one of the things that became clear to me is that part of what draws me to horror is such an unusual artistic genre because it affects you physiologically, right? You can watch a tragedy and feel really sad. You can have an emotional response, but you're not going to be like jumping out of your seat unless the acting is like a little off brand. Horror, if you're not jumping out of your seat, the movie didn't work, right? You're supposed to have startle reflexes and be shocked and be terrified and scream out loud. The reason for that is that horror functions on a logic of bodily participation. We feel like we have, to just be a little bit blunt about it, skin in the game. Right? When Rosemary goes through that whole long, torturous experience of being gaslit by her husband, raped by Satan, coerced by her neighbors, abused by her neighbors, gaslit by her doctors, imprisoned by her doctors, and eventually delivered of a child while unconscious, we feel anxious with her. There was a review written by a reviewer named Kathleen Carroll in 1968 when the film came out that said that the power of the film was in Mia Farrow's performance, that she looked like a captive fawn surrounded by malign actors all around her. So the supernaturalism of that film, the Satan stuff, isn't ultimately the scariest stuff. The scariest stuff is how terrorized she is in her home by people that she wants to trust, like her husband, her doctors, her neighbor. And I started to think about what's the effect of putting, in effect, like an essay on women's rights to choose into a horror form. And the answer, I think, is to get people, and I don't just mean women, I mean men too, to physically empathize with Rosemary. So the horror genre in the 70s became a vehicle through which to build public empathy for these terrible, dehumanizing circumstances that American women found themselves in all the time, and, hot sidebar, still find themselves in all the time, and find themselves in increasingly all the time since the Dobbs decision. Okay, so horror films had this capacity and still have this capacity, and it's being leveraged more and more by horror filmmakers in the 2020s to make us feel like the horror that we're witnessing happening to the female protagonist is our problem too. and affects our bodies. And interestingly, what I learned over the course of researching the book was that these 6 films meaningfully accelerated the women's rights movement in the US. So going back to Rosemary's Baby for a second, there was lots of really important grassroots activity, obviously, going on around women's reproductive rights in 65, 66, 67, 68, but nothing worked, right? Every legislative measure failed. Then Rosemary's Baby's on screens in theaters for a year. That film was insanely popular. It was on screens for a really, really long time. So 68 deep into 69. And in early 1970, New York State overskipped the liberalization effort and just legalized abortion outright. So why did that happen? Many reasons, right? It's multifactorial, but one of them for sure is that literally millions of people watched a woman suffer through an unwanted pregnancy under duress so that she eventually gave birth to the Antichrist. It made it more real for people. Same thing happens with the dynamic of domestic abuse in the movie The Exorcist. The same thing happens with domestic abuse and the Equal Rights Amendment effort and the Stepford Wives, and it rolls on and on from there. So I started to realize that these films were actually a powerful tool for political change. They weren't just reflecting the zeitgeist, they were adding steam to the zeitgeist and the direction in which it was going. The last part of the book, which I added very late in the game, I sort of thought, oh, I'm going to write a book just about the 1970s. And my editor was like, a good idea would be to talk about what's going on since Dobbs. And I thought, oh, I do have something to say there. So the final movement of the book looks at these 3 reboots of the original 6 films that all came out in 2024, right, in the wake of Dobbs. One is Immaculate, which maybe I see a lot of nodding. One is The First Omen, which is a prequel to The Omen, and the other is Apartment 7A, which is a prequel to Rosemary's Baby. All 3 of those films take the reproductive and domestic violence dynamics that are latent but visible in the original films and make them explicit and totally unmistakable. So horror filmmakers now, particularly feminist horror filmmakers like Arkasha Stevenson and Natalie Erica James, who made The First Omen and Apartment 7A respectively, are realizing the power, the feminist discursive power of the original 6 films and are rebooting it and updating it for our current horrific historical and political environment. So that's the story of the book, and I will stop talking there.
Well, but
Do you want to go first? Okay. That's the way it was in the program, and then good, excellent. Okay, so why am I here? Other than being an incredible fan, admirer of my beloved Eleanor. Maybe because I teach film like Rob, or because I've written on early modern witches, kind of early horror shows. Or maybe because I once taught a class called Tragedy and Horror When Bad Things Happen to Good People and Why We Like to Watch. But I'm actually probably the least qualified person here because, as Eleanor knows, I do not like to watch. I hate horror. And from my point of view, the question is, how could anyone like watching films like these? Like, let's scare Jessica to death, or he knows you're alone. And I've always sort of felt that the classic feminist critique of horror films vindicated me more or less. So horror films, especially slasher films, are pornography in the Catherine McKinnon sense. That is, they treat the torture of women as a turn on. And somehow at the same time, they treat female sexuality as terrifying, monstrous. So that's bad. And then there's also the great German film theorist, Siegfried Krakauer, sorry, my screen, basically saying horror films are fascist. It's a straight line from Cabinet of Dr. Caligari to Hitler. The world and anyone who likes those films think the world is full of horrors and only authoritarians can save us. And apparently I learned that there was a 2024 horror film probably playing in November 2024 about a zombie kangaroo with orange hair. And I think people went straight from that film to the voting booths and thought, only someone else with orange hair can save us, bigger monster. Anyway, it turns out that a lot of people who are kind of feminist and not really fascist love horror films too. And they've been working over time to explain more or less why I should love them also. So, for instance, film theorist Robin Wood tells me that I identify with oppressed victims, and so horror fulfills my nightmare wish to smash the norms that oppress me. That one doesn't really work because I score kind of 0 on the oppression scale, gender notwithstanding. So, okay, let's try another one. Kasha Silverman tells me that horror films satisfy my innate masochism. But I don't really think you can be a masochist if you're a total hedonist. So that one doesn't work so well either. Carol Clover tells me that these films, especially slasher films, it's a body of cinema that's spectacularly nasty towards women, but because the final girl survives, maybe it's just a tiny bit less nasty at the end. Doesn't quite do it enough. So then there's all the neuroscientists who come in and they tell me that horror trains my predictive powers and my power to master uncertainty, which is essential to survival. And it produces dopamine and adrenaline and endorphins that make you feel high. And also you feel really relieved when it's over. But horror tragically does not get me high. And I may feel relief when it's over, but I also feel what Eleanor brilliantly calls and called attention to a moment ago, the horror hangover. That is tragedy, catharsis, horror, a really bad hangover, which goes a long way to explaining why I don't like horror. I don't like hangovers. But Eleanor is also the first person who persuaded me not only that horror actually does some good in the world, it doesn't just make you a fascist or masochist, but that I might even come to like it. And part of this lies in the major rebuttal of the feminist critique that she offers. And it's a rebuttal, and you probably got some of this in her remarks. It's a rebuttal that doesn't rest just on speculations about the individual psyche of the spectator, somewhere deep in the disembodied darkness of the soul, but it rests kind of astonishingly on a set of political facts. So we get these brilliant, totally brilliant readings of the various ways that 1970s domestic horror films reflected the horror of women's experience. But that's not really the main point. And for me, in this book, the kind of main point and the wow moment is that these films really were directly responsible for legislation and judicial opinions that responded to those horrors. In a sense, they effectively, and maybe Eleanor will tell me this is overstatement, but I think the claim is persuasive that they created 70s feminism, or at least a big important piece of it. So you don't have to see Roman Polanski as a feminist filmmaker in order to see, and you really don't want to, in order to see his films doing feminist work. And as Eleanor describes it, basically tens of millions of people experience viscerally the horrors of female experience, and they experience it together in movie theaters, and they scream together. It's basically more people than at any political rally, screaming together, a year-long screaming protest. That does something. And astonishingly, legislation or judicial decisions, and Eleanor's only given you a small piece of them in her remarks. There's lots of them throughout the book. This legislation and judicial decisions that were unthinkable one day appeared after these films appeared suddenly not just thinkable, but necessary. Before Rosemary's Baby, this is a quote from the book, 10,000 American women died per year due to illegally performed abortions. 10,000 per year is 100,000 per decade. That's quite a few people. And after Rosemary's Baby, Roe v. Wade was suddenly possible. Almost no one even mentioned domestic violence before The Exorcist. It doesn't show up in any of the journals or anywhere. After The Exorcist, suddenly domestic violence appears on every agenda. They're criminalizing it. There are safe houses arising around the country. After the Stepford Wives, Congress went from pretty much zero support to the ERA to almost universal support. though, as Eleanor points out, that's a slightly sad story. Anyway, and so on. With each of these moments, it's really palpable. So when Eleanor first told me about this project, I confess that I was skeptical. I may not have told you. I thought, really? Horror films turned all those stiff suit wearing senators and congressmen and the Supreme Court justices into feminists by making them empathize? Well, after reading Eleanor's book, yes, it is actually true. Weird, but true. As she writes, these films made that suffering seem like an emergency, and then they made that suffering follow viewers all the way home and nest there. Well, there's only one thing that Eleanor says that is really not true, and I'm going to grab this as my really not true, and that is on the book's cover. 1968 to 1980, 12 years. No, this book is about a lot more. It already presages at least 3 prequels. So Eleanor's big book on the long history of horror, ancient to modern, that's coming out from Princeton, big book. We'll have to have another one of these. There's another one on zombies that's close to done. And oh my God, there's another one on Dante's Inferno. So really talk about scary. This is really so bad. And the book itself, this book offers its own sequel really by reaching forward to the present, as Eleanor suggested. We have these extended discussions of contemporary horror films directed by women. My favorite is one Eleanor didn't mention, the description, Creep, a radical feminist rebuttal to the domestic horror genre overall, in which the potential female victim takes the power into her own hands by wresting the camera from the abusive male director and making herself the maker of her own film. The book is also really more broadly, and this is not just 1968 to 1980, it's a big book about the political power of art in ways that we're not used to talking about it. We're used to talking about the reign of capital and so on, but here we have something that draws a direct line between popular art and political change. And this is Eleanor again. It gives voice to those social and cultural art gives voice to those social and cultural problems for which a critical vocabulary does not yet exist. And then it turns that critical vocabulary into change. So Eleanor has not only somehow seduced me into getting pretty close to watching some of these films, maybe. But she's even making me, what might make me like activating all those endorphins and cingulate cortex and so on without having to be a masochist. And as she points out in her comments also, she makes me like these films because she reminds me that these are about our present political moment, a moment when we are watching progressive feminist legislation of the late 20th century and judicial decisions slowly stripped away. And as Eleanor points out, the ERA still hasn't passed. I love this passage. It's just never been a compelling enough idea, I guess, that women should be guaranteed equal rights under the law. We're not just at a standstill, we're rolling backwards. And as Eleanor writes, women's political reality in 2025 may be terrifyingly close to what it was in 1970. So things are bad. We all know that. And I'm always a little skeptical when, I hear people at Upper West Side cocktail parties saying things like, I'm going to move to Canada. No, I'm going to move to Australia. Some people may do this, but mostly people don't do that. And I love that Eleanor says something really, really different at the end. She says, this is quoting, I'm not going to leave our colony for 3 reasons. 1, I love the colony. 2, I love too many people in the colony. 3, I am a pacifist, but I'm not opposed to fighting with words. So I'm going to stay and fight, and I'm going to do it by writing. And when I need to, by screaming. I hope you will too. So shall we give it to Eleanor?
Yes. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks so much, Eleanor. This book is really, really, really readable. Like you just kind of slurp it down. I think, but it's the insights are also of a nature that they seem at the same time both revelatory and kind of self-evident at the time that you're reading them, which seems to me like the hallmark of real insight. That when you're reading the book, you think, well, yeah, that's what the film's about, but you never thought of it that way before you're reading your words. My response will actually start from the present, and actually from a fairly recent film, which is the only feminist body horror film that ever topped the American box office. It's not The Substance, which is probably what you thought it was, which only came in sixth on its opening weekend last year. The film I'm talking about was called Swallow. Is actually directed by a man, the first feature of Carlo Mirabella Davis. And I suspect that most of you haven't heard of this film. Swallow is a film about a wealthy housewife whose life of seeming privilege has come at the cost of her absolute dependency on her husband and husband's family. Isolated by him and later pregnant, she reclaims some measure of bodily autonomy by the crazy action of ingesting inedible objects, beginning with marbles, moving on to glass, and etc. And that's where the body horror comes in. And it topped the box office in America, despite the fact that it only made $1,700 at the one screen where it played, which was a drive-in in Florida. So how was this possible? Well, the punchline is that the drive-in in question was the only movie theater that was open in the country because this was the start of the pandemic. But it being the pandemic, the film soon enough showed up on streaming, where it became my second pandemic-era streaming rental after Trolls World Tour, which every parent, I guess, ended up renting in those early days of COVID. But then I began to notice something because the next horror film that showed up on my various feeds as a streaming recommendation was the Australian film Relic, directed by the first film, I think, by Natalie James, right? Which is about an elderly woman dealing with dementia and her daughter and granddaughter. That same year, 2020 still, Roseanne Lang's Shadow in the Cloud, which is a very knowing homage to Alien, took the Audience Award at the online iteration of the Toronto International Film Festival's Midnight Madness sidebar. Next, 2021, came a couple of British horrors with women directors, Rose Glass's Astonishing St. Maud and Prana Bailey Bond's Censor. And then, as theaters reopened, the cycle of women-directed horror continued. Julia Ducournau's Titane, which was the first post-lockdown winner of the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Festival, Nia DaCosta's Candyman remake, and yes, eventually, The Substance. So what was happening here, I wondered, was the spark that had been lit by Jennifer Kent's The Babadook back in 2014 finally reaching payoff, only for its impact to be cruelly blunted by pandemic-era shutdowns? Was horror being reclaimed to feminist ends in a fashion parallel to the concurrent cycle of race-inflected horror inaugurated by Get Out in 2017? But if so, then I think Professor Johnson's book has the merit of reminding us that horror's intersection with feminism is a very long-standing one, just as, in fact, horror's intersection with race is long-standing and certainly was not the invention of Jordan Peele. But there is an important difference between the films that I was just talking about and the films that you talk about in this book, because with the exception of Candyman, the films I just mentioned were all independents, whereas your focus is on major studio releases. And they're all significantly more international, whereas your focus is understandably on American social history and political history. But this suggests some questions, which would be like, what happens when we broaden our purview to include these other types of films? What kind of comparative analysis would suggest itself when we follow your lead in mapping out this terrain? Because I think thanks to this book, we can now begin to ask questions like, for example, how does the spousal abuse allegory of The Exorcist play out in the different racial context of the film's blaxploitation recycling as Abby, which was released the very next year? Furthermore, if last year's Sydney Sweeney vehicle, Immaculate, can be thought of as post-Dobbs, which I think is obviously right, But then what would we want to say about the remarkably similar Russian film Deliver Us from the year before, 2023, which basically has the same plot, but which can't really be thought of as post-Dobbs because it's in Russia. What does that comparison reveal about women's shared experiences within these otherwise very different national contexts? I think I'm steering into the laziest kind of scholarly response here, which is the sort of you wrote about this, but what about that kind of response. So let me redeem myself by saying that I think this is kind of in the spirit of your book, the generous spirit, which is both an exemplar and a mandate for work that needs to be done. It presents itself explicitly as a launching pad or as a baton to be passed. And it ends by envisioning a collective of feminist voices applying themselves to this task, much as Julie liked the ending of the book. So did I very much, particularly the final paragraph. I'm afraid I folded the page over. I know some people hate it. So here is the final paragraph. But it's one that, of course, you deserve to hear in Professor Johnson's voice and not mine.
Thanks. So the book ends like this. Julie actually read the previous paragraph. Oh my gosh. Thank you. As I said, the book ends like this, and Julie read the paragraph immediately before. So I'm going to end this book on domestic horror with a plea. Please write journals, write nonfiction books, write histories, write op-eds, write biographies, write blogs, write books, write letters to your children, write letters to your abuser, write letters to your congresspeople, write essays, write memoirs, and above all else, write screenplays, and then go direct them. Help us all to find our voices and help us use them to scream.
Thanks for having me, and thank you, Eleanor, for writing this book. I'm going to speak about two things in very general terms, briefly. One is genre, and one is women talking. Is that good? Women talking, both the novel, the Miriam Toews novel, and Sarah Polley's film. So first I want to say one of the things I was really interested in was how Eleanor stages the intersection of the word horror being used in two different ways. It names a specific genre, and it also is a more general, diffuse descriptor of an experience or a feeling or a situation. So she offers us a very helpfully flexible definition of American domestic horror film. And she's reiterated that today. So this kind of genre often stages a feminist, a woman protagonist. It's often in the home. It's in this enclosed, often claustrophobic space. There are a number of different conventions, and a work of art can sort of pick a la carte in that very flexible and inexact way of genre. But the word horror is also used otherwise, as in this sentence, and this is from the Rosemary's Baby chapter. Rosemary's Baby made readers aware that reproductive violence was not only a horror that women were subjected to, but also, and she goes on. So in one instance, then, horror names a genre, and in the other, it names this feeling or maybe this socio-political situation that permits or that even causes that feeling or experience. But she also collapses those two poles of the definition into each other, as in this sentence. In the world that these films create, she writes, if you deny a woman any one of these three things, and the three things are a sense of personal safety, actual personal safety, that's one, equal rights, and crucially for the book, reproductive rights, then you deny them all. And in so doing, you create horror. And horror then resonates in both senses of the word, right? You create a situation that is horrific, and you create this subgenre, this film genre of American domestic horror. I'm belaboring this, but I'm belaboring it because of the artwork that anchors the epilogue, which is women talking, the two versions of women talking that Eleanor writes about. So I read the Toews novel a few years ago, and I really, really loved it. Reading it did not make me think at all about the horror genre, though clearly the events that it narrates are horrific. I then, after reading Eleanor's book, went and watched the film by Sarah Polley, which I also really, really liked. It's really different, but I really liked it. And Eleanor points out that this is not a film that is typically grouped in the genre of the American domestic horror. But I understand how one might include it in such a project. And after reading the book and watching the film, I could see how, the sound of a woman's scream or the visual of a handful of blood and teeth can count both as a convention of the cinematic genre and as a recognizable sign of domestic violence or of misogynist violence, right? And how Eleanor's point is how these things are superimposed one upon the other. It made me think about how works of art that hew closely to genre conventions train us to read or to watch or to appreciate works of art that hew less tightly to them, but nonetheless take them up. And so how they might help us in the act, in the ethical act, in the political act of recognition more generally. I might be saying something really ordinary here. I often find myself in that position. But Eleanor's book has helped me understand that ordinary thing in a way that right now feels particularly crucial. Popular genres, cinematic or literary, can condition how we understand our world by using recognizable conventions. Conventions work by being recognizable to a community of readers or appreciators. We agree upon them as a community. That said, recognizable convention, at least in practice, so often calls upon acts of stylization and foregrounding. And I'm curious about how we balance the political utility of recognition and that kind of stylizing that representation so often depends upon when it comes to the subject of violence. So I also want to take a moment to point out how the recognition of convention can be noted in subsequent works of art that participate in a genre, that knowingly participate in sort of that, wink, wink, nod, nod way in a genre. I like the moment in, I forget now which chapter it is, but in one of the chapters when Eleanor is writing about, I think it's Alien, about this protagonist, I think it's Sigourney Weaver, I think it's Alien. And Eleanor writes, and I can hear her saying this out loud in my head, oh, she's seen this film before. Thinking about genre as a learning process, as participating in a genre can be seen as a kind of learning process. And I've been thinking about that moment in relation to the last line of Sarah Polley's film, Women Talking, which announces to an imagined future reader, quote, your story will be different from ours. That is to say, I've been thinking about the learning process in general as it relates to political history. I've been thinking about slow change, about rupture, about reversal, and about imagined futures. So Eleanor's book is obviously making a historical argument, an argument about the 1970s, an argument about 2024, 2025, but it is also about patterns of behavior that know no such historical bookends. And so I've been curious about how other genres have or might participate in this work. I've been thinking a lot about the Gothic since I read Eleanor's book. I recently read this wonderful, also very readable book, readable in the way that Eleanor's book is readable, by Helena Kelly, Jane Austen's Secret Radical, which I think is like this literary criticism for a wider audience that I also hope will be a growing genre. Anyway, she writes about Northanger Abbey, which is, understood to be a parody of the Gothic genre, and at times is, hysterically a parody, but as Kelly points out, is also about that terrifying lack of control one has over one's own reproductive body in certain circumstances. This is all to say that it seems like it might also be a time for the reboot of the Gothic and the reproductive rights Gothic in the way that Eleanor charts the post-Dobbs horror reboots. So one of the things about the Gothic, as I understand it, and it's not my specialty, is that it stages the eruption of, the revenant, the ghost, a sensibility that we thought had been superseded. And in what I understand to be its original manifestation in the 18th century, that that eruption often looks suspiciously medieval. And that's the first time I've said medieval tonight. I did it. This was not the book that I expected Eleanor to write next. I always read Eleanor's books. And this one was different than the others. This is the one that is, not the same. Medieval names the field of literary history that Eleanor and I both work on. And so I was surprised. But I want to go to my favorite part of this book. It's in the epilogue. She's writing about women talking. And she writes about a scene that she is particularly moved by. It's when two young girls who are in the colony run out because the census takers are coming down the street in their truck. At this moment, she writes, and I'll quote, they choose to become part of the historical record, ellipses, however small that mark of legibility. And it vaults her into this beautiful reading of the future anterior. When you read this book, it will be different. It will be a different kind of story. And this was the moment where I thought, oh yes, this is the Eleanor who is the politically minded, ethical medievalist that I've always known. Here she is. Yeah. I mean, throughout I knew that too, but this was the moment that was the spark of recognition. So thank you. Okay.
Eleanor, you get to respond.
Thanks. You've all given some. Thank you. It's almost like I don't understand technology. As my students know, I really do not at all understand technology. Thank you all very much for your wonderful and provocative comments. I have so much to say that my primary difficulty here is going to be in organizing my thoughts. I guess I might start with responding a bit to Sarah. So it's true that this book doesn't look anything like my medieval books, but I have to say that being a medievalist was a really significant inflection point for the decisions I made, because if you go through and watch the movies, they almost all have like a weird medieval Catholic theological unconscious. And so I was very awake to that stuff. And I was like, hang on, that's not really how an exorcism ritual is supposed to work. Let me go. Like in The Exorcist, right? One of the things I talk about in The Exorcist chapter is how my big revelation when I was watching that film for the 58th time was that the possession narrative, the like supernatural possession narrative, Reagan is possessed by a demon, it's supernatural, isn't really just a supernatural possession narrative. It's a literalization of a medieval legal idea about what it is to marry someone. If you're a woman and you marry a man, you become his possession. That is bedrock Anglo-American legal precedent. So the possession narrative is both actually supernatural and just a literalization of a legal fact. I don't think I would have necessarily seen that if I hadn't read a gajillion medieval case law sort of anecdotes about men beating up their wife. This is like, I have a good example. Actually, I won't get into it. It's really gross. 1396, a guy beat his wife up really badly, and he said, I should do this because she belongs to me and I was correcting her. That's the doctrine of correction. It stipulates that a man who owns the women and children in his house have not a right, but an obligation to physically correct them when they do something bad, something that, for example, might violate Christian norms. So I was conditioned to see that stuff. And so then when I looked at The Exorcist, I was like, oh no, I know your moves, you closet medievalist William Friedkin filmmaker. So the medievally stuff kind of crossfaded more than you might imagine with the 20th century horror films, although I demoted it in the explicitness that it has in the narrative. Other thing about Sarah's comments, which I loved, is, thinking about other kind of genres and moments when this kind of politically resistant work can happen. The Gothic is a good place to go. Comedy is also a real good place to go. Comedy and horror have a lot in common. And any people in the room who are hardcore horror fans know that oftener than not, comedy like bubbles up through the surface of horror as like a little break, and often like an accelerator of intensity as well. Get Out is a great film to go to for that. Get Out is one of the scariest films I've ever seen, and I laugh a lot when I watch it because there's a lot of inside jokes, and many of them are self-referential, like the film referencing the Stepford Wives, for example, or the film referencing Rosemary's Baby. Hot sidebar, does anyone remember the name of the grandfather who starts the body snatching org in that movie? His name is Roman. Same as the name of the arch bad guy in Rosemary's Baby, and the same as Roman Polanski, of course. That kind of citationalism, not a coincidence. And there too, my medievalist skill set is wide awake. So, comedy does a lot of a parallel kind of work with horror, because as horror, as Julie was talking about, and as I talk about in the book, horror is this genre that has its effect because we're sitting in a theater screaming with other people. Scream with Me is the title of the book for a reason. If you're watching a movie and you're like, oh, this is medium scary, I'm not super afraid, I'm like a 4 on the fear scale, and the person next to you is losing their actual gob, you do get more scared over the course of the film. Similar with laughter. If you're watching a movie and you're like, I'm a little bit amused, but the person next to you is like doing that like snorting laughter, you will laugh more. So comedy and horror have in common that they're contagious. They're both physiological and they're catching, right? You might feel really sad watching a tragic movie and the person next to you might be crying, but probably if you look over at them and they're crying and you're not really feeling it, you're going to be like, get your act together, rather than like, oh no, I'm crying. But if they're really laughing, you're going to laugh. So horror and comedy have quite a lot in common, sort of epiphenomenologically, and I am very interested in that. I would also say that if I really dig deep, which I do love to do, the domestic horror genre is actually super, super, super old, right? In cinema, it kind of has its efflorescence between 68 and 80, goes to sleep for a couple decades, more or less, comes back really loudly in like about 2010 and goes through the present day, and I expect us to see more and more and more of it. But Geoffrey Chaucer wrote domestic horror poetry. As those of you who have taken Canterbury Tales with me, you remember the Griselda tale? That's a domestic horror narrative, hands down, no question. And he knows it is, right? And he sets it up so that we have to sit there and think like, where exactly is the abusive husband's accountability in all this? And why doesn't Griselda extricate herself? Well, she can't. She's been very badly gaslit, just like Rosemary. So this move to like tee up domestic violence, which Chaucer didn't have that word anywhere in his mind. He might have thought of something like cruelty, some civitas, savageness is sometimes like a line that legal people in the Middle Ages will draw in the sand between allowable physical battery in the home and something that's disallowed, if it's really cruel. So he might have thought that, but more to the point, he's interested in what it's like for women to be hurt at home and hurt at home and hurt at home and not being able to escape, right? It's a very, very old question. So, and of course, Chaucer in his heart of hearts is more a comedian than a horror writer too, and that's kind of an interesting synergy. To go a little bit to Rob's comments, the sort of what happens, like what if we look at and for domestic horror outside of the United States? I have done some of that, not an infinite amount of that. One direction I've gone with that is actually the next book that I have written, which is this crazy long, like 4,000 years of the demonization of women in the Western canon. And so you definitely see a lot of like what winds up being domestic violence oriented horror in a lot of different cultures, in a lot of different languages, in a lot of different periods across time, really going back to ancient Mesopotamia. It's kind of like always there, except that in the 1970s in American cinema, it kind of bubbles up to the surface with this real ferocity. Bracketing that like real deep historical stuff, a film that I desperately wanted to write on, but it would have diluted the Americanness of this project, which is why I didn't do it, is Possession, right? 1981, so very historically continuous with, that is one of the most distressing DV films I have ever seen. It's also about sexual assault in a really, really complicated way, but the Sam Neill character brutalizes Isabella Adjani in scene after scene, and he stalks her. That film is just a painful exploration of how domestic violence propagates itself in the home and what she then has to do to kind of try and get out of that dynamic. There's a really complicated backstory to the shooting and making and the dynamics that produced that film, which I don't want to get into, but suffice it to say, there were DV and like women's rights films leaking out all over the place during this period, some of which are, a lot of which are tied to domestic violence, and some of which definitely also to reproductive horror and reproductive coercion and reproductive control. One of the best recent domestic horror films I have seen, which did not get billed as a horror film at all, but I definitely experienced it that way, was I forget the year, it might have been 2017, the Palme d'Or winner, the Turkish film Winter Sleep. Have you seen that? It's not a horror film. It's got billed as a drama. It's very, very long and extremely good, and it is a meticulous exploration of the gradual dehumanization of the wife character in the film and her final imprisonment in the end. And it is grueling to watch. It's horror in the same way that Women Talking is horror. Not quite as grotesquely violent, but abjectly psychologically violent. And so you're seeing these kinds of films coming out in many different cultures now all the time. And I have to assume that that's partially because women have it bad everywhere at the moment because our fates are inevitably tied to things like the rise of global fascism. And I think as that happens, women are getting less and less safe, as are people of color, as are people who lack economic resources, as are people who are in minoritized religious areas, et cetera, et cetera. So as sort of massive global political shifts skew right, we're just going to see more and more of these kinds of films, I think, in all languages, not just the United States. There is a lot of focus on it right now in the United States, again, because of Dobbs. And I think we'll continue to see that. And I expect to see more and more body horror coming out from female directors in the coming bunch of years, some of whom are likely in this room. And finally, I'll get to Julie. I love what you said about not loving horror. It moves me so deeply that you still read my book. My Substack, I have a Substack, as some of you know, and I have a, goodly number of subscribers and followers, and I get messages from people on that Substack every week that are like, "Dear Eleanor, I hate you for making me think about this movie because I hate horror. No, but I really like your Substack." And I've thought a lot about what that is, right? And I think who wants to look at something horrendous when they can just like kind of gain the knowledge in some other way? So I actually have like a lot of people who are like, "I hate horror. Here's your subscription fee." And I'm kind of interested in that. I'm interested in the idea that you cannot like a thing and yet see that it has something to tell you nevertheless. And that's kind of part of why I wanted to write the book. I wanted to write the book in part to not quite welcome people into horror, because that's a bit of a paradox, but to kind of like say there is something to be gleaned from this genre that one might dismiss, right? Horror usually gets sort of like tossed off as a schlocky, lowbrow kind of genre, much less so since the 2010s. I mean, horror has gotten like smarter and smarter and more political over about the last decade and a half, owing to individuals like Jordan Peele, owing to particular production houses that just cannot seem to make a bad film, like A24. There's a lot of reasons that horror is really having a moment right now, but horror is really having a moment right now. And part of the reason I wanted to write the book is to say, like, horror has had a moment before. And that was a really important moment. And we need to steer the horror ship towards righteousness and goodness rather than towards regression, fascism, and all the bad things that also sometimes do animate horror. Like, Lord knows there's a lot of really retrograde horror out there. And I don't want to get into it right now because it makes me feel depressed. But it's out there. So you're definitely right on that. Yeah, I'll stop myself there. Thank you all.
So we have some time remaining for questions from the audience. So if you raise your hand, I'll be happy to call on you and you can ask Eleanor or any of our panelists a question. Yes. Oh, yes, and please wait for the microphone to reach you.
Thank you, Ellen, for the book, for being the cause for this wonderful event, incredibly illuminating and powerful. I guess my question is about religious politics. So at least two of the films, Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, are engaging in, how would I put it, a kind of parroting of certain presumptions about Catholic practice, but they're doing so, against a cultural backdrop that is predominantly Protestant, even though there is a significant Catholic minority. And so one of my questions, do you think that religious political dynamic at all played into the reception of the film, that for the largely Protestant audience, it gives them enough critical distance without being just outraged and offended, that then could allow them to take critical distance against the cultural assumptions on which anti-abortion laws are based? So, but there's a kind of a dark side of this question, because 68 is Rosemary's Baby, Exorcist is like 74.
73, yeah.
73.
So end of 73.
Okay, in the middle of that is Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't call him a theologian, but so he starts popularizing among American evangelicals this notion of the rapture, and that the Antichrist may very well, if he may be alive, and that the rapture is imminent. You better get your soul right and everything. So if you read the Rosemary's Baby through Hal Lindsey's lens, there's a way in which you said no one would root for this pregnancy because it's the Antichrist. Well, actually, some of these dispensational, because that's hastening the rapture, and that's hastening Christ's return to earth and all the rest of it. So I guess one of my questions is, against the backdrop of this religious politics over the longue durée, could these films at once do the political work you're talking about in the moment, but also paradoxically like sow the seeds for a kind of reaction later?
Yeah, great question. I love that question. I have a lot to say, but I'll try and be succinct. So first of all, I totally think what you said about Catholicism, re-Protestantism is right, and that Catholicism provides like a sort of screen on which to project one's own anxieties about one's religion without actually feeling like one is having anxieties about one religion. A sort of flip, but I think very deeply true way to sort of tie that all up is that, you know, Catholicism is Protestantism's horror hangover, right? It's like always, it's like the ghost that haunts Protestantism. And that means that Protestantism wants to look at it and then demonize it and run away. So I definitely think that that's right. I definitely think that's in play here. Complicating that a little bit, but not contradicting it, is the reality that particularly regarding reproductive rights, the Catholic Church was alone in continuing to oppose reproductive liberalization in the 1960s and 70s, alone, like particularly in New York State. It was like the Catholic Church, and then later it's like Phyllis Schlafly and her people. But in 68, like synagogues stood up and they were like, yeah, like women maybe a little bit right to choose seems like a good idea. Protestant churches were like, there's a lot of young women showing up dead at hospitals, like maybe we should shut this down. And the Catholic Church was like, absolutely not, never going to happen. And people knew this was in the Times all the time, this exact problem. So the Catholic Church had like, as it were, uniquely bad press around reproductive rights. Another aspect is that the Rosemary's Baby script was written almost verbatim by Ira Levin. It's based on a novel, and I should have said Polanski's film adapts Ira Levin's novel almost word for word. And Levin, who was Jewish and was a native New Yorker, was reading the Times and was seeing this and was like, ugh, let's make a horror novel about that actually kind of pillories the Catholic Church and like puts the blame where it belongs. The Exorcist, in a way, is a reversal of that. Friedkin said of the film that he tried to make it, and I find this like makes me go cross-eyed internally when I try to square this with the reality of the film. But Friedkin said that he intended that film to be sort of like an optimistic piece about the power of faith. Because in the end, the Catholic pater like enters the house and saves the little girl, and we're supposed to be like, oh, good job, Father God. It's almost like he didn't see his own film. I don't know, but that film, he understood that as a like, Catholicism is good. I don't think the American public saw it that way, but so there's a complexity there as well. And then the other thing I want to say about sort of like the legacy of these films, you're right. There was kind of like a retrograde crab-like walk which actually replicates a scene that was cut from the original Exorcist when she crawls down the stairs backwards. Anyway, there was this kind of retrograde move that a lot of the sequels to these films made. So particularly The Omen. The Omen, which we haven't talked about a lot, is a fascinatingly brilliant and surprisingly progressive film about women's reproductive rights, women's need for safety in the home, et cetera, et cetera. The later films in that franchise, which I really hope you've not seen, are super bad, and they get increasingly like right-wing proselytizing. In fact, in the end, very late, and I'm gonna blow it for you because like I don't wish this on you. Sam, what's his name? Sam Neill plays the grown-up Damien, which is just weird because he can act, and I don't know why he picked that part, but he did. Maybe it was after Possession. Who knows? So he's playing the old Damien, and in the very end, like he gets killed. The Antichrist gets killed, and immediately this like chorale of Christian music comes on, and all these biblical excerpts start scrolling down the screen, and it's very like what had to happen here was that the Antichrist had to be born so that Jesus could get born and defeat him, and it all happened for a reason. Yay, woohoo! Like the rapture has arrived. So absolutely, the franchise developed that particular franchise developed in exactly that way. The other franchises developed a little differently, those that were ultimately franchised. But in that one, you really can see that like really sort of startling tag to the right. Yeah.
In the back, please.
Hi, this is for Eleanor. It was a wonderful talk. I was just wondering, you brought up Possession, for example. How do you kind of wrestle with films that as you said with Possession, it could be interpreted as this kind of depiction of a domestic violence situation. But then I've also seen interpretations of it that are very, I would say, misogynistic.
Definitely.
You know, about how, you know, women are inherently evil and, oh, my ex-girlfriend was just like this. So how do you kind of deal with these films that can be interpreted in these sort of very extreme manners as either a feminist text or an endorsement of sort of MRA ideals?
Yeah, and several of the films, even in Scream With Me, have at least some of that duality. I mean, you can certainly mine a conservative reading out of The Exorcist, for example, as my students in my class know. But, you know, and I would also say that many of the films in Scream With Me, particularly Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and The Shining, there's a very uncomfortable dynamic in play in those films between the director and the leading female actor who was indeed abused in the making of the film. So even there's like a real serious ethical problem. In the film Possession in particular, as you may know, the director of the film had just gone through a messy divorce. It's pretty clear that his intention in that film was to make Isabella Adjani look like a monster. It's interesting to me that when I watch that film, I think the Sam Neill character looks like a monster. And I've written about this a little bit on my Substack. And I think really what's interesting about that film and films like it is they force us to grapple with that ethical blurring. The fact that Sam Neill throughout that film, the character he plays, he thinks he's doing what he needs to do to like kind of get her under control. But if you watch the film kind of locating yourself in her perspective, which is how I watch it, it's utterly, utterly different to that. And one of the things that I think sustains that in that film in particular is there's a lot of narrative cutting. You're mostly aligned with him, but you're often aligned with her. The films in Scream With Me, with one exception, which is actually The Omen, you're always aligned with the female protagonist. Actually, and in The Exorcist, you're aligned with Damien Karras some of the time, but he's not the bad guy in the film. So there's very little cross-cutting in these films between the female protagonistic sort of heroine figure and her assailant. You almost never see things from the bad guy's vantage point, and that reduces the degree to which we might reflexively align with the bad guy. Okay. In Possession, it's different. The Possession is a really complicated film along those lines because I think the film does want us to see things from Sam Neill's perspective much of the time. And there are lots and lots of films like that. The Turkish film I just alluded to, Winter Sleep, you see everything from the abusive husband's perspective. And what I find utterly gripping about that film is you still hate him and think that he's the monster and that she's innocent, even though everything is structured through his vantage point. So it's a really neat trick the way that film makes that all land. Right behind you.
Hi, it's so nice to hear you talking about these things again. Question is regarding when you speak a little bit in the introduction about how film operates as a different form of medium because we experience it collectively in the movie theater, and you know it forces you to kind of reckon with everyone else's reaction to it. Considering that mode of experiencing film has changed a lot, especially since the pandemic. And considering the domestic space is now the space in which many people are watching horror films, how do you think that change of space either affected the way people are experiencing horror films or, you know, affected in a way that makes them feel it more because they are in the domestic space and the horror hangover might be a little bit more real? Or do you think it kind of diminished that shared collective reaction?
Great question. I think the answer is probably yes to both. The shortest answer is yes to both. I think that absent a theatrical context, all of that like audience, that sort of affective empathy amplification effect is all massively reduced. On the other hand, if you're sitting in a movie theater watching a horror film about something bad happening in the domestic sphere, you know that you're not at home, that you're surrounded by people, and that if someone randomly started assaulting you in the movie theater, presumably people would help you. So in a way, the theater is less scary, and in a way, it increases the empathogenic function of the films. So I think both things are true. The larger question of like, how does streaming affect horror? I'm not sure how to think about that yet. I used to say really like doom and gloomy things where I was like, well, now that streaming's happening, sadness. We don't have this like collective filmic experience anymore, except for those of us who choose to spend $4,000 going to a movie and getting a thing of popcorn, because it's like films have become a bit elite from an economic standpoint, and streaming is crazy cheap. So that's a problem, and it makes me sad. And I was all talking to a friend of mine about how, oh, it's awful, like nobody's gonna have shared filmic experience anymore. So many of my relationships with my friends are in part structured by us having seen films together in the theater and talked to them, yada, yada, yada. And then a horror movie came out this year, which I bet every single person in this room knows about and doesn't think of as a horror movie, but it is. And that movie is K-pop Demon Hunters. Just in plot synopsis, a bunch of predatory girls are hunting demons who are trying to take over the world. That's a horror plot line, but it gets to be a musical. And every kid knows it. My kids are dressing, one of my kids is dressing up as one of the K-pop Demon Hunters for Halloween. Everyone she knows is also dressing up as a K-pop Demon Hunter for Halloween. And I thought, oh my God, through the like fusion of horror and musical, streaming has recollectivized because all the little kids are running around singing these songs that they all know. So they're like participating in this film together by re-articulating the musical part. So part of me is like, oh my God, are we going to see like more musicals coming out in some way, like adult, what I don't know, through the streaming function? But I do think that, you know, wondering about how streaming can diminish the collective power of any work of art is a really, really meaningful and significant question. And I think and hope that filmmakers are trying to kind of make works that benefit enough internally from being on the big screen that they will still have big theatrical releases. I'm curious to see how Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein does in the theater and then in the streaming format, because they're, you know, right up against each other. So I'm going to be paying attention to how people react to it in the two formats.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. This is just a follow-up to that, but I'm wondering if you think that the politics of these films is maybe less salient when they're experienced in more siloed contexts.
Yeah, I think that almost certainly is true, right? Because unless you happen to be the person for whom the politics of the film has an immediate direct resonance, they go over your head. Whereas if you're watching The Exorcist next to someone who is a survivor and they're like duck and covering the entire time, you're going to feel differently about that movie, right? They're going to react to different scenes than you, who just like a good projectile vomit scene, might react to, right? There's this sharing of affect that doesn't happen as much in the streaming context. So yeah, I think that there is a blunting effect that's very likely there.
Eleanor, I'm going to abuse my position as moderator to follow up immediately on that. Is it possible that what you were talking about with your daughter, which is remediation, fan culture, the reiteration of whether it's a franchise movie or whether it's a one-off movie through the many forms of popular screening content that we can both make and consume ourselves, is having something like that scaling up or accelerant effect now that in the 60s and 70s you're seeing in the common experience of theatrical exhibition?
Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. I like that idea, because the idea that we would somehow, through our increasingly rapid fire tech, diminish our capacity to encounter art as a collectivity, that like breaks my heart, particularly as a medievalist, right? In the medieval the idea that you would own a book and read it alone, very few, right? Most experiences of art were collective in the middle, just because of resource poverty. And now we've got this wealth and this internet and all this stuff, and so we can encounter art alone as often as possible. And that I find that really devastating as a historical reality. But I do think there's a possibility that there's a counter discourse there, that like, you know, TikTok or just making little videos and hiving things off and circulating TikToks among friends and kind of creating memes. I think that does do work too. And I do find that like younger kids who are sort of like younger than undergraduate age, they do have shared cultural reference. They're not the same kind of ones that I had. I had whole movies memorized as a kid, as I bet every single person in this room who's over the age of 26 also did. But, you know, now there are like little memes that get remembered and learned and circulated. And I think there's a there too. And sometimes I wonder if what that really augurs is kind of a diminution in the emphasis on narrative, and maybe create space for something more kind of lyrical, something that's less dependent on what's on either side of it, but the more like autonomous little islands of affect that get shared among people.
Right, let's go back to the audience in the front row there, please.
Thanks, Professor Johnson. I'm really excited to read the book for sure. I had a question again, also on the political climate and how your research has found how that relationship is when it comes to the creation of these films that star the female horror perspective. And I'm curious as to how the volatility or the suppression of the current politics and how that will affect future filmmaking and these narratives that hopefully will push for more women's rights, but clearly with the current political climate, we seem to be going backwards. And I'm curious how you've found in your research how that seems to, what relationship that has.
Yeah, I mean, I think the truth is, sort of what I said at the end of the book, my great hope for women in this country is art. I've lost faith in the law. I've lost faith in a lot of major institutions, but I believe in art. And I believe in filmmaking, and I believe in filmmakers, and I particularly believe in young filmmakers, because I think that they correctly feel like they have very little to lose and everything to gain from making bold, like progressive horror films that are going to make them money. So that's a win, right? Because horror, like the ratio of expenditure to profit in the horror genre is unbeatable in other genres. Like the movie, which one is, oh yeah, Paranormal Activity, which I talk about, that cost like a couple $1,000s to make, and it made like $100 million. That had like literally an unthinkable rate of return, right? And that film has a very interesting gender politics to it. So the economic gains are significant. And the sort of public gains are significant. And I think a lot of filmmakers are seeing that right now and are wanting to make horror because they specifically want to say, like, we're living in a horror movie and we need to address it and talk about it and work it through and not avoid it. The most powerful line in the movie Rosemary's Baby to me, by far, is this line when Rosemary is being raped by Satan and she says, "This is no dream, this is really happening." Because of course it was true. American women were being raped and forced to maintain their pregnancies all the time, left, right, and center, happening again now, right? And it's a huge problem. So this is no dream, it's really happening. I think young filmmakers need to make films and say, like, this isn't fiction. It's really happening. And I see it everywhere. I mean, I see it all the time now, which gives me hope.
Okay, maybe there's time for one or two more. Okay, question over here in the front, please.
Hi, thank you. I know, like both in your book and in your lectures, you talk about how you interviewed women who saw these movies when they came out, and how like they saw a certain scene in like Rosemary's Baby that in The Omen that reminded them of abortions, and then like in The Exorcist where it reminded them of domestic violence. I was wondering how you went about interviewing this woman. Like, was it informal, formal?
Both. And some of the people I interviewed are still in complicated situations, so I can't go into a lot of detail about how that went.
Okay, thank you.
In the second row there, please.
Hi, Professor Johnson. I had some questions about remakes, and you were talking about that a little bit, and you were talking about kind of the simultaneous collectivism of culture, so bringing that collectivity into new generations, but at the same time making that political message more explicit, and perhaps like the economic structure of film nowadays is like very different than it was in the 70s and how that impacts it as well. But I'm curious how making those films more explicit targets a different type of audience, and whether you think that is positive, negative, or is obviously nuanced, and how that is in tension with creating a new collectivity.
Yeah, that's a really subtle and smart question. And I mean, I think the answer is definitely the more explicit the left-wingy politics wind up being, the fewer right-wingy people might be interested in watching the film. But I think that the horror genre actually tends to reduce that effect. And the reason is that horror has astonishing demographic appeal, right? People will go watch a horror movie because they want to get scared, the kind of masochism argument. Even if they sort of know the politics are going to make them feel irritated, they're still going to go see that movie. So there's a way in which horror has like a particularly deep and consistent reach, no matter where you are in the political spectrum, because people just go to see horror movies and they like to see them in the theaters. right? Because it is scarier. And then, of course, it's also more, politically kind of juicy in that context as well. So that's a side effect. So I'm not super worried about the explicitness dampening the message much. It's definitely the case that some people who go to see a movie because they like to be scared will leave and be like, well, that was a bunch of horrible claptrap in one way or another. I often wonder what people who went to see the movie Immaculate and didn't know about the ending thought about that ending, because it can't have been easy for everyone. I don't know if you know what happened at the end. Well, it's very violent. Baby gets killed. Anyway, or a non-baby gets killed. A complicated birthed thing gets killed very violently by a nun. So I don't know, like, I'm sure there are instances where something gets just a little too explicit. There's probably a little bit of an uncanny valley effect here, whereas things approach explicitness, they get like increasingly effective, and then, oh my God, totally ineffective. And then it crosses that valley and it becomes allegory. Probably it's sort of like that. But I will say I have a lot of particularly anti-domestic violence horror movies from the last 5 years or so that I really like. And almost all of them are pretty explicit, but I think that they're shy of that uncanny valley. There, so that you could still watch it and be like, no, this isn't a really good horror movie, and kind of be affected by the anti-domestic violence messaging, but not necessarily at a conscious level. So like Men, which came out in 2022, great example of that. Heretic, a lot of people went and saw the 2024 movie Heretic because, like, what a strange thing to cast Hugh Grant as a horrible monster. We love Hugh Grant. Who doesn't love Hugh Grant? I don't anymore because of that movie. But you watch that movie and you're like, oh, I love Hugh Grant. And then it becomes this like, horrendously upsetting film about utterly predatory misogyny. And it gets associated with all kinds of interesting things, like sort of like a decadent kind of religiosity. It's very, very interesting. And the film is not, it's not like anti-Christian at all, because in fact the ending of the film winds up being super duper duper Christian in tone. So the film leaves a lot of room for a person to encounter this film, to feel kind of challenged in what some of their latent assumptions might be about like how faith practices justify certain attitudes toward women, and then that all gets overturned in the end. And there's just a lot of films like this that have come out in the last 5 or 10 years. So I have hope there too.
All right. At the risk of not ending on a note of hope, we're going to have one final question.
Feel free to not answer this, but as a huge fan, I'm curious, like every time I read your Substack, I can hear your voice and I appreciate it. And if you have your TV show, I will be watching daily.
You have to make it.
Well, don't tempt me.
Don't tempt me.
I'm really curious to know what your process is when you're going through this, but this is your moneymaker, so feel free to not really comment on
No,
it.
it's
But
fine. This is for the Substack or for the books?
for everything, like I mean, I'm not the biggest avid reader because ADHD doesn't allow me to read much, but sometimes it allows me to watch films. And as a person that likes to do the literary analyses, sometimes I wonder if you like sit and watch the film once and then go back, or do you like pause it every 2 seconds, go back? I'm really curious to know what that process looks like for you.
Yeah, it varies. When I sort of identify a film that I think I might want to do a Substack on, I screen it and I have my laptop in my lap, and I like take notes while I watch it. If I need to stop it, I stop it and go back and rewatch it. I usually will watch it a couple of times before I finish the Substack post. But honestly, the key thing is less how I watch the film more than and more whom I'm imagining writing to. And it's my undergrads. My like internal audience is my undergraduate students. And so I'm always thinking about you guys. And I imagine I'm like, should I make this point? Will they care? No. I think, will they laugh at this joke? Probably. And I like to do that. So I imagine you guys live in my brain all the time. Most of what I do that's good is I do because of you guys. Yeah.
Putting a request for weapons, so.
I'm writing one on weapons. It's tough. It's tough, as Charlie knows. I'm thinking, you can confirm I'm working on one on weapons. Yeah. Yes.
All right. Let's thank Eleanor.